That's ready. Took a few weeks off, but we're back. It's just showing you.
Yeah. I figured you'd do that.
How many weeks did we take off?
I don't know, 3, 4.
Each one had its own reason, but it wasn't planned.
No.
Every
No, it
week
wasn't
we're like,
planned.
oh, we got to get back to it. And then
Yeah.
fall break, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Literally, I think I framed you up, and I think you just slightly changed positions.
What do you want me to do?
Now,
Sit lower?
yeah, kind of.
'Kay.
Slouch. Make your grandma not proud.
Yeah.
Would your grandma do that?
No.
My grandma
What?
made a big deal about posture. She'd
No.
always be like, come on. No?
I don't know.
Hmm.
My grandma didn't make a big deal about much. So
Mm.
maybe that's the difference between
Very
you and me.
low-key, nonchalant.
Yeah. Very
Kinda like
chill.
you.
Yeah. I come from a very gentle, relaxed family.
I do not.
I know you don't. You're the opposite. Yeah.
So we honored Pastor Caleb yesterday in the Sunday morning huddle because it's Pastor Appreciation Month, and isn't it always weird when they talk about you and like we're we're a team, but
What do you mean?
You get what I'm stepping in?
No. I think I do, but
Usually the compliments are like,
you balance Trey out so well.
yeah, like
What did Tommy
you're
say? He
exactly
was
what
like-
Trey needed, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, basically that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think
he says that you keep me in check.
which is true. Thank you, Tommy, for recognizing and acknowledging the work
doesn't
that I
listen.
No, I know. I know he doesn't. No, we do. I think our working relationship is probably more collaborative than. Why is the music still playing? How long is this?
It's 3 minutes. You got one more minute.
I think our working relationship is more collaborative than it used to be, for sure.
When you were an intern?
I was never an intern officially, but
What
yes.
do you mean? I feel like I've always been collaborative in how I lead.
Yeah. I guess more in like the teaching and like direction,
Sure.
like that kind of stuff. But I was kind of siloed when I first started. I feel like I was doing a lot of college stuff, and
True.
then it just kinda
7 years
merged.
ago.
7 years ago, yeah, almost 7.5.
That's insane.
Yeah,
I feel like that timeline makes sense. You got to serve some time where you're not,
yeah.
you know. But yeah,
I don't feel like I really started like pastoring until like 2 years ago,
I would say 2020.
2020. Yeah,
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I almost say the same thing. Like,
yeah.
I just think the way we viewed ministry kind of shifted.
Yeah, we were trying to
2020.
keep the boat floating. I feel like we were like startup. It felt more like a startup kind of a thing.
Right.
And then now at some point it shifted to being like a congregation with people that wanted to know where we were going.
Which I think is the life cycle of a church plant, probably.
Yeah, definitely.
Although I do a lot of things different if I start over. But Lord, don't let me start over.
What would you
I'm
do
good.
differently?
What would I do differently?
Yeah.
I would launch later.
In life?
Yes.
Sure.
However, I wouldn't be who I am today without that. So it's like,
Yeah.
I like that I did it.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
retrospect, I would have at least waited one more year. I would have launched with someone like you to begin.
A team or something.
Yeah.
A person. Yeah.
And little things like our name and, you know, when
Sure.
we first launched was not Passion Creek.
Would you have gone to the theater again?
No.
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool.
In theory, when it's easy for casting a vision for it, but in practice, it's
And then
hard.
like everyone would tell us we wanted to come, but then we saw us in a theater and that was weird. Like turns out everybody thought it was weird, and it is kind of weird. I don't say that disparage people who are in meeting in theaters. We made it work, and God is gracious, and people meet in basements. Like, but yeah, if I were to do it over again, I'd go straight to a school.
Yeah.
School has been so much better, but we didn't have the budget to launch. Like we had 5,000 in our church account, and then we're like, cool, let's start. So much. It's like it's a miracle. Yeah, it's quite a miracle. But now I feel like we're at a moment. So my mind is all in Corinth right now. Our church actually went through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, possibly before you rolled up.
I think we did 2 Corinthians with me.
Okay. But
Culture
you weren't-
hacking.
You weren't really. Wow. That is what it was called. Wow. But you weren't really preaching that much then, huh?
No.
No.
No. My first sermon, I think, was in 2019. It was like fall or something in 2019.
Yeah.
So I remember prepping on Thanksgiving Day. I was so nervous.
Oh, fun. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're now at the point, and this is to give kudos to you. My mind is in Corinth. Well, not, that could be a bad thing because Corinth is pretty bad.
Yeah.
But my mind is meditating on 1st, 2nd Corinthians all week because we're going to be in Acts 18 this upcoming week. But a big major problem in the church in Corinth is some of them say I follow Paul, others say I follow Apollos. And it's like fun because like back then you barely preach, but now it's like I just feel like our church is led by us, and so there's factions. So we're here to
Set the record straight. Which one of us is the eloquent Apollos?
Yeah, right. Which one's Paul?
Yeah.
Paul was. It's interesting because with Paul, he talked about how he didn't come with eloquence, even though. So he would argue he had it, but he decided not to.
I think my impression of Paul, well, from what I've read from other people too, like other scholars who study just Paul as a person, is he was physically
small.
A lot of people say, yeah, he was physically unimpressive. And they say Apollos may have been taller, more celebrity pastor type in that time period. Mm-hmm. And Paul also wasn't like...
Apollos was clearly eloquent. Like,
yeah,
you'll see
he
that
had
in Acts 18.
quippy phrases and he had little things that caught people's attention. And I think Paul was more about like... Again, we don't know, obviously, but a lot of people think Paul was maybe known more for like how brilliant he was and how like bold
his writing was more powerful than his presence.
Yeah,
they're like, man, you seem so bold, and then we see you face to face, and it's like, oh, is this the same guy?
Yeah. He comes in unimpressive, but he's so brilliant and he's so smart, and
it kind of reminds me of Eugene Peterson, because if you listen to Eugene Peterson's sermon, you're like, but then you read some of his writings, specifically his letters to like his pastoral work, and it's like, wow, this guy's brilliant.
Yeah.
But in certain arenas, it's like, oh, that you could just fly right by him.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. I mean, I don't want to throw any other pastors into this, but I'm thinking, yeah, there are a few I think who would I would categorize that way, where they're preaching. Their presentation isn't great, but their content is so profound and like clearly just like anointed that it has a power to it, a weight to it.
And that's so subjective, right? Like to declare if somebody like grabs your attention or not. It's all about preference, style, time period, trends, things like that. Yeah. Personality is very subjective.
Who you're drawn to.
Anyways, I'll never forget. I was in Iowa. I think I mentioned this in the podcast before, but I went to a church in Iowa, and it was very much kind of like how we're leading ours, where like the lead pastor wasn't preaching every single Sunday. There was like this teamwork, and it was mainly two guys, very much like our church. And I had the dumb question of like, hey, so which one do you like more? And these members were so great. They're like, neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but it's God who gives the growth. I was like, that was a test, and you guys passed.
Yeah.
Even though
it wasn't a test. You really wanted to know.
Because they had distinctly different personalities, and it was really cool. And I was like, this is such great teamwork. But in my immaturity, it's like, so which one do you like? And I was so blessed by their answer.
Yeah.
So anyways, I don't know why we went there. Corinth. You preaching a lot. Yes. So speaking of that, let's talk about idolatry.
Yeah.
Give a summary of your message Sunday, and then we'll kind of work through it.
Yeah. So Paul, in Acts 17, middle of Acts 17, Paul is in Athens on his own. And Athens is kind of this profoundly influential, probably one of the most important cities in the Greco-Roman world because of how much influence it has for philosophy and ideology, and the great intellectual powers come from Athens. And so Paul is in a city that I imagine probably knew about growing up, being educated as a rabbi and things like that, but was still kind of foreign to him. So he shows up and immediately recognizes the first thing it says that he notices is all these idols and pagan statues to these false gods. And so he does what he usually does. He goes to the synagogues and he goes to the marketplaces. He preaches the good news. Some people hear about it, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and they're like, well, we need to know more about these gods that you're coming in with. And so they kind of invite him, strong arm him a little bit to come and share what he's learned at the Areopagus. And so Paul goes. He's not on trial necessarily, but it seems like it's a little bit of a danger. Like they're questioning him. They want to know what exactly he's there to say.
Yeah.
And so he gives this speech, really brilliant speech. Most scholars believe that what we have in Luke is actually a summary, because you can read it in less than 2 minutes in Greek, and it's highly unlikely Paul only used 2 minutes here.
But his previous messages, what chapter were we in when we talked about that? Remember, and he got cut off in Acts 16, I believe.
Yeah.
Many believe he was given a similar sort of sermon because he wasn't referencing the Mosaic Law, because they were like, what's the Mosaic Law? So instead he goes to creation and just idolatry and who God at creation, essentially.
Yeah. So he basically gives this speech, and he does a lot of different things at once. He's contextualizing the gospel, but he's also kind of targeting their beliefs and their philosophies and the idols that they would have believed in, and basically showing that the God he's presenting is not one to add to your life, but it's kind of the one to reorient your entire life around. So a lot of people ridicule him when he mentions the resurrection, but some people follow him, and they decide to follow the way of Jesus, and so he takes them with him.
And so Mars Hill is also
the Areopagus.
But our translations didn't say Mars Hill.
Yeah, it's the hill of Ares, or Areopagus. I think that's the Roman, the Latin, and then Greek.
I honestly didn't know, because I never took philosophy. Besides, we had to take like an intro to philosophy in college for our theology degree, but it wasn't much. So I didn't realize that about Socrates being killed there.
Yeah, that was one thing that came up in a lot of the commentaries, was like, by the way, Socrates was, I think with him, it was more, he was put on trial for like corrupting the youth by introducing these foreign deities, pagan, other gods that they had no idea, they didn't know about, hadn't heard of. So there was for as tolerable they were for like the different gods you could worship, they were really weary of like someone bringing something completely new for the gods. Like the gods were, my understanding is the gods were the ones that you don't touch. Like who's there is there.
But isn't that so true? People who claim tolerance, there's always you can't fully be tolerant.
Yeah.
There's always a tipping point.
There's always something that you need truth on. Like absolute truth exists. And so they're...
but wouldn't they now retrospectively say, man, Socrates was our guy? Like...
In Athens?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
Or do we just look at him kindly in history, but Athens was always,
Yeah, I think Athens... especially by this time, a lot of this stuff happened. These philosophers, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all came
What's the
centuries
order?
before. I don't know.
I thought it was Socrates.
Like timeline?
Time chronologically. I thought it was Socrates, then Aristotle, then Plato. I don't know. Keep going. That shows you.
No, I have no idea. Yeah. But these were like the... mascots is a weird word, but they were like the intellectual heroes. Like everybody knew Athens because of these people. And so, the Areopagus was where Socrates was tried for corrupting the youth, introducing these foreign gods, and he was executed there. So that's why when it says that Paul was invited, they brought him to the Areopagus. It's not necessary. I mean, I'm sure some of them were really genuinely interested and they wanted to hear, because Luke says that all the Athenians were just obsessed with learning new things. But I think there is a little bit of like, Paul's kind of in some hot water here. So he's got to be really careful about how he communicates the gospel. And obviously he contextualizes it really well. He doesn't talk about Torah law or Moses or anything like that. They don't know who that is.
Right.
Or maybe they do. I don't know. But that's
and maybe he'll, again, when he establishes a church, he'll get there. He's going to teach them the scriptures, the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But you start where they're at.
Yeah.
And then take them where they need to go. I looked it up. Socrates was first.
Okay.
470 to 399 BC. Then Socrates was Plato's teacher. So Plato was next from 428 to 347 BC. And then Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So Aristotle was 384 to 322. So within the span of 150 years, you have those three pillars of Western philosophy.
But Aristotle, I don't think, was from Athens. I think he made Athens like his hub. Like I don't think he was like born and brought up there. I think he studied there under Plato. I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
So,
but I'm just talking Western philosophy now.
Sure. Yeah. Not Athens specifically, but yeah, that was Athens. It was the belly of the beast. It was a really important city for Paul to be in. And it's crazy that he was there by himself. Like I imagine that was.
And it's even more just historical evidence of the early church, not just looking at Luke, but like these are well-known people. Also, I was reading this morning, for Acts 18, Gallio, do you know his brother is
Galileo?
No, his brother is oh my gosh, I'm having one of those mornings. I've already Seneca. His brother is Seneca.
Oh, wow.
Who actually taught Nero.
Yeah.
Who like was Nero's rabbi-ish of sorts, you know, philosopher.
Yeah, yeah.
And Nero turned out to be a terrible dude.
Yeah.
But Galileo actually helps the church.
Yeah, yeah.
But brothers to Seneca.
Yeah.
Who people quote Seneca today.
Sure,
like, he's a Stoic.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, yeah.
So let's talk about the Stoics.
Yeah. Yeah.
I find that fascinating because you're talking about Epicureans and Stoicism, and those two worldviews are predominant today. You really see young men, people are really gaining traction online if you especially espouse Stoic philosophy.
Yeah, Stoicism.
You have like a lot of military type people talking about that. But just kind of just even comedians are like, Stoicism is the way. And I think there's stuff to learn from Stoicism. I've never actually read Ryan, what's that guy's name? He's like modernizing Stoicism. He keeps writing the historical accounts. Ryan somebody. Ryan Holiday, I believe is his name.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I've never read his stuff, but
Yeah,
I've been
yeah.
interested to. I just don't have time with everything else.
Yeah.
But I think that'd be a good primer. Again, because I think it's helpful, and this is kind of a philosophy you and I have. We don't just demonize everything else and not learn about them. We're doing what Paul is doing. Paul goes, "Hey, I know these people. I'm going to quote them, but I'm going to show the sufficiency of Jesus is what you're really looking after."
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach that Paul has. Paul doesn't immediately... I mean, he calls out their ignorance early on.
Sure.
And then at the end, he does call them to repentance. But on his way there, he's basically saying, like, look, you guys are kind of on the right track. Like, you're not there yet.
I've heard
You're
people say
missing.
that about Socrates. Like,
Yeah.
man, if he was around the time of Jesus, I think he'd have been like, I'm pointing to this guy.
There was an
But who
article I
knows?
read that said Paul was the better Socrates. Like, Paul went farther than Socrates, which Paul was brilliant. So maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Stoics were... And again, this is broad oversimplification. There are a lot of different like sects and how, you know, intensely people live this out, different like denominations, so to speak. But Stoicism largely was about like God was like this transcendent kind of force, this like divine like energy, and you tapped into it by...
Which people talk about all the time today.
Yeah, exactly. You tap into it through self-discipline and living a life of virtue. Like you can tap into that logos, that reason, that God by... logic and reason and virtue and stuff like that. Yeah.
And when Stoicism was very predominant in that time, and I think I've read Paul assumed different Stoic virtues among people. So there's a lot of like, when he would talk about the way of life, like he wouldn't say like, remember to pray 3 times a day, like all that stuff, like discipline, self-control was assumed, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, especially in the Greek world, so much of society was built on like what we would probably call like self-improvement, like bodily training, but also because of Athens, cities like Athens, really just Athens, your intellectual mind, and then the way Greeks thought too about this division between your mind and your body. So,
which is why Paul has a robust theology of the body,
Yeah.
because he's confronting Greek thought.
no, what you do with your body, Matt, you don't have a body, you are a body, that kind of thing. 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection, which is central to it's kind of the high point of his
Yes.
argument in this speech. And what he's going to write about later, right after this, he starts the Corinthian church, and then he later writes to them reminding them, no, there's a bodily resurrection. What you do with your body matters, things like that.
Isn't it also interesting how quickly he leaves Athens? Mm-hmm. Did you read anything on that?
Nope.
Yeah, so I'm reading on Corinth, and they were like, yeah, many believe he was so discouraged by his encounter in Athens that he was in Corinth, and I don't want to give away my sermon Sunday, but it was very much like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. It's the same pattern. I preach the gospel, then I get like stoned for it.
Yeah. That was the other thing that made me look twice at this speech. Was a lot of times where I've heard this taught, it's basically just been like, look how brilliant Paul is at being
And
able
how
to...
effective it was.
How effective it was. Like, look, you can communicate the gospel everywhere. But I'm like, Paul kind of failed in that sense here. Like, this speech is really odd because you get a handful of people who follow him, and Luke is sure to mention them by name, which is also telling. But largely, like, what you would expect was for the Holy Spirit to come on Athens, and then for Athens to like revolutionize the rest of the world the way that it did, and on Pentecost or something like that.
We don't have a letter to the church in Athens.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. The belly of the beast, like Athens still stays the beast. It still stays this like pagan sort of, as far as we know, pagan polytheistic.
But he spoke against the rulers and principalities. Like he did his work, and it will one day, he was planting seeds that he didn't immediately see results from.
And he's right. God is going to judge, that Jesus will was resurrected so that he's going to judge idolatry, the idolatry that they're giving themselves over
And it
to.
was rare for the gospel, still today, to really take root among powerful, influential people, because the message of the cross is like, you have no reason for pride. You are not, like, lay down your power for the sake of another. Like, not only is our message Christ died for us, but also we die with him. We don't die for Christ, but we die with Christ. We suffer, we embrace the sufferings. And so that's a hard message. So even Corinth, which has prestigious, noble people, most of those people didn't come to Christ either. So the group he has in Corinth is a bunch of nobodies, lowly people. That's why he starts his letter by saying, yeah, the cross is foolish, and this is why the gospel has come to you, you lower class people.
Yeah, there's a lot about, like, even the way that, like, Paul's not trying to win a culture war here. Like, his goal is not to revolutionize Athens and turn them into like a Christian nation or whatever. He's just saying, like, no, these are where you're giving into idolatry and where you need to repent, and I'm gonna move on. The Stoics were big. The Epicureans were kind of the opposite.
Oh, can I say this real quick?
Yeah,
you can apply some of Stoicism in your life and it will get better.
sure. Yeah,
Like, again, waking up at 5 a.m., doing your, making your bed. Like, again, it's stuff that you're hearing.
Self-discipline is largely missing.
And read Galatians 5, read Galatians, Paul talking about, or 1 Corinthians 9, I beat my flesh, I'm suffering, I'm training, I'm looking to become more like him. So there is something about discipline. There's something about restraint and self-control. And so I think our message, we're not being honest. I think just that framework of mind, like, oh, those are Stoics, so we can't listen to them at all. It's like, well, there's truth. There's truth there. The full of truth is found in Christ. And yeah, there's a world for discipline. So that's why I would say, like, yeah, Ryan Holiday, I'll pick up that book. Like, and I think it's helpful too, because, no, I don't know. I was about to say Stoicism isn't seen as a religion now, but did they even see themselves as a religion then? It was just more like, that's what's so deceptive about, like, secular philosophy and everything. Right. Oh, this isn't a religion, but yeah, it is, because it's a way of life. It's your answer to the biggest questions. Yeah,
there was a spiritual element to it that may not be as communicated today.
Because they were far more spiritual than we are, in the sense of their acknowledging of the divine.
Yeah.
Wasn't it like, it was impossible to find an atheist?
Pretty much,
in that time. Until the 1500s.
Yeah.
Like, now it's like impossible for somebody to not at least think atheistic thoughts. Like, it's just such a flip.
Yeah. In Athens, it was easier to find that quote from that play, easier to find a god than a man.
Yeah, so that's crazy.
Everyone just kind of assumed, the gods. You had gods for the harvest, gods for your sex life. You had gods for, all those things. So yeah. I think
now today we have a course. We have a, to fix those things.
In a lot of ways, we are the aftermath of Athens. Like, we're still intellectual. We still like to learn new things and do, with the trends are all about, putting into practice new ideas so that our lives might be better is a very Athenian, like, way of thinking, I think.
Self-improvement. Yeah. So you have a line. I thought it was great. I said amen out loud. If the undercurrent of Athens was superstition, self-discipline, and hedonism, I would argue the undercurrent of our culture isn't that different. So we just covered self-discipline, now to Epicureans, hedonism, but also I'm interested in your thought on superstition. So how do you see that today? So whichever order you want to take.
Superstition quickly. Athens was large. I mean, obviously, because of all their idolatry and things like that, all the different idols, it was a very superstitious. Even the legend about the Athens, the founding of the Areopagus or whatever, where Epimenides comes and cures, this is all a myth, whatever. But the legend is he comes and he cures the plague by having them sacrifice to the one god that they missed. Is like a very superstitious way of seeing and thinking in the world then. And so even the fact that they still have these statues to the unknown gods, like, it's like, just in case we missed one, or just in case there's something there, we want our lives to be good. I think I see that in our society, obviously not with, like, Roman gods and Greek goddesses and things like that, but more in, like, the way that if we are Christians or we would consider ourselves religious, the way that we tend to, like, manipulate God for our own gain. So even when we talk about things like the practices, or we're gonna have to really combat this when we talk about fasting in a few months in February.
Sure,
it's really easy to turn the way of Jesus into a superstition where fasting becomes about your own self-improvement. It's project self. It's let me just become the best version of me that I can be. Which some of that's good, whatever. But then God just becomes a means to your own end. And I think that's very superstitious. If I miss my Bible reading in the morning, my day's not going to be as good, as another.
Sure.
If Sabbath isn't as good, that means I'm not going to have a good week. Or if I, whatever. And then even those who aren't Christians, that I think
it seems like reading astrology is back, and there's all sorts of things that are gaining popularity again. Crystals.
We're looking for a way to like wield supernatural power so that we can have some kind of control over our lives. And I think that's really prevalent. And just like it was in Athens, it plays out differently, but we all have an impulse to like get control over our lives and ourselves by doing something. And so for some of us, that was the end of the message. Was some of us are just adding God to that list of things.
Yeah.
And that's not really how this works.
And one pastor that moved from Portland to LA, he was like, LA is way more spiritual.
Yeah.
Like they talk about spirituality a lot, and yoga and Zen and different things like that. So yeah, I think it's easy for us to, I think it's helpful for us to constantly be analyzing culture and recognizing it can shift, it can change. So like, those books that were really helpful 15 years ago that talked about we're all nuns, we don't follow anything. It's like, I think that's still true in the sense we don't like ascribe, our communities ascribe to a certain thing, but we seem to be getting more spiritual because there's so many issues in the world. You're grasping for something divine.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's, now hedonism.
Yeah. So the Epicureans were the opposite of the Stoics. A lot of us, I think, have a misunderstanding. From what I read, I learned this researching last week. They weren't so much about like all pleasure.
I thought that was interesting you mentioned that.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's a good...
They believed in moderation. Like they wanted balance, but life was meant to be lived. That was really the aim. Life isn't just something to be learned about and suppressed. It was something to be experienced and lived out. And so,
which we all assume
today,
but that would have been kind of foreign to many ears back then.
Yeah,
in a world that's filled with plagues, no medicine.
Right.
Like most kids die before they're 10. Like.
And again, there's a lot of good truth in the way that I think the Epicureans were approaching life, in that God, the world is good, and God created us in the world to enjoy it, as well. So good food, enjoy, like the love of your spouse, enjoy. They would take that further and put that outside of the confines of marriage maybe, but things like that, where they were really driven by that. But they believed that mainly because the gods weren't involved in our lives. They were kind of far off. They were somewhere else. They didn't really care. Kind of deists maybe, where maybe they created the world, kind of set it in motion, but then they didn't really have any care for how we lived or what we did.
I would argue we grew up in a hedonistic culture, clearly, but that's why Stoicism is gaining more attraction, because it's like we've gone all the way to the end. We've gotten everything we've wanted. We've indulged in that cake.
Yeah.
And now it's like,
Yeah, there's no...
Like, I think that speaks to young men's impulse and desires.
I do see that. I think in a lot of young men, they're looking for, because they see what they could be, and they see who God made them to be, and they see that the way that the cult, like the love yourself, be true to yourself kind of movement is dying out in a way. It's shifting, at least.
And I want to be careful here. I can talk all day about men, but from pastors and leaders I've listened to, for women, it's almost like the hedonistic lie is getting more and more alluring to them in a certain way. So I find that fascinating. So I don't want to dive into that too much. These are half-baked thoughts. I don't want to be a seed picker.
Yeah, there you go.
That's exactly. Segue.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting phrase.
Yeah. It literally, BDAG says,
cool.
It's someone whose communication lacks sophistication. So somebody who, again, he says, I didn't come in with eloquence and beautiful speech.
What is the phrase that CSB used instead of seed picker? What was the...
Ignorant show off.
Okay.
What is this ignorant show off trying to say?
Seed picker sounds more fun.
Yeah. The idea, so these two philosophers, these two groups of people hear Paul, and they hear that he's preaching about Jesus and the resurrection, which in Greek was anastasis. So a lot of scholars said they might have assumed that, because that's a Greek feminine noun.
Yeah.
They might have assumed that Jesus had his, goddess wife, anastasis. And so
I've never heard that.
Here's this Jewish man coming, preaching about these two gods. Who are they? Well, he's not really saying anything. He's not very eloquent in his language. I'm curious too with First Corinthians, you had the sophists. So like sophistry was like a huge deal, where sophists were basically these people, these orators who were trained in debate and eloquence, and their goal was not to get to truth. Their goal was to like persuade you to like them more, basically.
Yeah.
So
more about emotion than
exactly.
intellect.
Yeah. Very like emotive and trying to like get you to, yeah.
Which is probably a pushback against the Logos people, right? Like pure reason.
I think so. I think, I know they were really influential at this time, and I know like this is a very,
is that where we
Greek
get sophistication from?
Yeah. Or sophist, wisdom. But it wasn't a Greek word for wisdom, but it wasn't wisdom in our sense. It was just, it was your ability to like tickle ears and make people think that you're smart and like you and things like that. And so it's a very Greek way of like communicating, was like your oratory skills, your rhetoric, your ability to like capture the minds and attentions of your crowd. And so Paul, I think the implication is Paul comes in not doing that at all. He's not very like witty, purposefully witty or anything like that. He comes in and he just, debates with these people in the marketplace and in the synagogues about this resurrected king named Jesus, who's really ruling the cosmos. And
man, I feel like most movies want to take the role of sophists. Like they just want to move you. It's interesting how you can see a movie and like root for the villain, and like be sad, when whatever. I was about to say the Joker. I heard Joker 2 is terrible. But it's like, oh my gosh, why do I feel for this person? Part of that's good image of God stuff, like backdrop. But like, I do think that's a win for a lot of people. Let's just be sophists. Let's just create this world, and you be so convinced of it. And then you'll think about it later and go, oh, that kind of didn't make sense, but I was all in.
Yeah. The sophists were, my understanding, this is based on
So
research.
you're saying they're based in Corinth?
Yeah.
I was less Athenian?
I don't know if it was less I've come across the sophists in my research in Corinthians, but not here in Athens. So I don't know if they were an Athenian thing or just a Corinth thing or what, but I do know Corinth was a port city, right? So they're bringing in all sorts of ideas and ideologies and worldviews and religions that are then going to...
So you were saying there was no modern equivalent to Athens. A lot of people, like the equivalent to Corinth is Vegas.
Sure, yeah.
It's like influential, powerful, but also just a lot of debauchery that's celebrated.
To be called a Corinthian was
Corinthianize.
Was a derogatory word for somebody who's very promiscuous.
Yes.
So they would say there were more, I think I heard this once too, there were more sex workers in Corinth than like townspeople, like normal citizens. So it was like different kind of Athens.
Yeah. So Athens would be, again, this is me assuming you've done this whole deep dive. Athens was less sexually immoral?
I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
It kind of is interesting because that's the only time we really see Athens in the biblical text, right?
As far as I know, yeah.
That's why we have an excuse. Like our job is the Bible.
The Bible, yeah. I did as much research to understand as much of the context of this passage.
300 to get more.
I watched 300. Leonidas I had to cut out of my sermon, but no, yeah. I think they were maybe. My assumption is maybe they were a little more devout. I don't know. I'm sure they had. I mean, they had gods and goddesses of fertility and things like that. But I know Corinth was much
Aphrodite. I mean,
Aphrodite. Yeah, exactly.
Was all about that.
Even the cult of like Artemis, which we'll get to later in Ephesians, I think was a little bit more sexualized. So I don't know.
Yeah, that is.
But Paul doesn't call that out here, which is also really interesting. So he's targeting just the idolatry, not their sexual immorality or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's all conjecture. I don't know.
Right. Everything we've said here. What is that?
Oh, yeah, our lawyer. Nothing we say here is the official.
Allegedly. No, man, I was going to take one more pivot. Oh, Epimenides.
Yeah.
An anemone.
An anemone.
One correction from the sermon, because you like to correct mine. You said 500 AD in both sermons.
Yeah.
It was actually 500 BC.
BC,
But talk more about that story. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, there's a legend, and I had to dig around for this because I kept finding, it was all about the unknown God. When you read about Acts 17, the very first thing Paul says is, I notice you're very devout. You have the statue to the unknown God. Let me tell you about this unknown God. And so I was like, what is that statue? And a lot of people just said, well, the Athenians were very superstitious. And so they, in case they missed one here, they had these different altars. But the more I kind of dug around, I found a couple of like very like dense academic, scholarly, critical articles that basically said, no, this is actually what's happening here is there's a legend of Epimenides, who was he was a Cretan. He was from the island Crete. So he was a philosopher or a prophet or whatever, kind of a pseudo-religious kind of person. And at this time, Athens had been ravaged by a plague. It actually had to do with something that they did with like these prisoners in a war or something. I don't know that part, but they basically had this plague, ravaged about a third of the population. So they call out for this Epimenides guys. Don't know how they know him or anything like that, but he comes and he assumes that they must have missed a god. And so he tells them, sacrifice to that unknown god, and then maybe you'll be spared. And so they do that. And then this unknown god becomes like a part of their culture. So yeah, really interesting little.
But I think it was fascinating. Like they would literally sacrifice lambs.
I think sheep. It was. I read it was like sheep, goats, lambs, something like that.
Have you heard that story about the missionary who went to this unreached people group and they were angry with another tribe, and the way that they would make amends is they'd each have to sacrifice a son.
Oh wow!
And then so the missionary went, you get it. Whoa. God did this. He sent his son to bring reconciliation. And it just like, so like they had these elements of the gospel and all they had to do was learn their language and say, no. There's a greater firstborn son.
Yeah.
So in my mind that like, hey, no. This unknown God that you're sacrificing a lamb for, like the Lamb of God came and sacrificed himself. Like how cool is that?
Yeah. I don't know if Paul knew that legend or not. It's possible he did. It's possibly, I don't know. He doesn't mention it.
Again, he's so educated. You would assume.
You would think that he would. So, but he doesn't mention it. So that's why
I see.
It's really easy.
That's why it wasn't the crux of the sermon.
Right. It's like, I want to be really careful about what I'm pointing out here. But that was a legend. That was a myth. And some people even argue that Epimenides, he wrote something about Zeus where he said, in Zeus, basically, we live and move and have our being.
Yeah.
And so Paul says that of God, obviously. So there's debate about whether Paul is quoting Epimenides there or not. It seems like he is because that is such a specific phrase.
Sure.
So yeah, really fascinating. Epimenides comes into Athens to tell them how to sacrifice to the unknown God so they might be saved. Paul comes to Athens to tell them how the unknown God sacrificed himself so that they might be saved. Really interesting connection.
Yeah, really cool. But again, I want to give that reminder, first of all, how human Paul is, but also how we just assume he was such a success. When we read this story, we paint it because we know how it all ends. But it's very likely that Paul felt like a failure at the end of this battle on Mars Hill.
You have to wonder what his expectations were too. Like he's had such good success. I wonder if
it's
he's
good
thinking,
not to psychoanalyze.
Yeah.
But we do know by the time he comes to Corinth, he's pretty depressed and he needs a word from the Lord. And so many assume it's got to be all of these things together, but it's almost like the Athens thing was
so close. Like what that could have done for the kingdom kind of a thing.
And that's why a lot of people say like, hey, why was Jesus on the road to Emmaus with these two guys we don't even know? Why didn't he go to Athens and say, I'm king and sit on the throne? It just shows the way of Jesus and the way of the cross. Yeah. Totally counter to the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's even cool too. It's not like, oh, we are here today, in the West, 2,000 years later, Christians, because he succeeded in Athens. It was like, no, it was the remote places. It was just the faithfulness of people.
Yeah. I mean, he escapes, so they don't put him further on trial, which is good. He has some followers.
Yeah, some people turn.
Dionysius the Areopagite, which I think just means he was one of the like council people. So like one of the people who were kind of in charge hear him and they're like, I like that. I want to learn more. A woman named Damaris. Yeah.
Well, all that to say, I feel like, man, Acts has been so fun. Yeah. Isn't it? Like, what's fascinating when you and I looked into researching to preach Acts, these parts of Acts people don't preach that often. And
it's hard.
And I never want to be like, oh, we're better than those people. But I think it does take work. But like, it is interesting how a lot of times like Acts 1 through 12 gets preached on a lot because I think there's like clearer lessons. And like, hey, look at the church being generous. But this stuff has been so encouraging to me. And it's also just to see how the rest of the Pauline letters, how they all tie together and understanding his situation. So like I would encourage people, if you can, to read 1st and 2nd Corinthians this week. Remember, he just got back from Athens. Remember, he was just in Macedonia, and he would go have a great thing going and then get persecuted and stoned and have to be left for dead and have to go to another town. Like, you keep all of those things in mind, and then you still see his boldness, his willingness to speak against the idols of Corinth, speak the idols of our own hearts. It's quite fascinating. And the reminder, of course, that you see in 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Paul is weak, but it's when we are weak that we are then strong. It's the Spirit of God that gives Paul this ability to endure and to keep pushing forward and speaking against the idols of wherever he was at.
Yeah.
Anything else? All that, we didn't even talk too much about idolatry.
I know, that was the hard part with I mean, we got into it a little bit with the...
I'm talking about this conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Stoicism and things like that.
True.
But yeah, I think the whole thing is aimed at, like I said, a lot of the, when I first read this, really, I remember I was in high school and it was basically like, look how good Paul is at contextualizing the gospel.
Right. That is the passage you always go to. And I don't think that's wrong.
No, it is that. But when you look at what he's saying, it's like, no, he's doing something more here. Like he's dismantling the foundation of Athens, like all these pagan idols. And if we miss that, then we're not reading scripture, I think, well enough to know like what would the same impulse that Athens had is inside all of us as well, to try and control our own lives by adding God to the myriad of other things that we're trying. And it's hard. Everyone know, like those things are different for everyone.
Yeah.
So, we're not in a city. I mean, maybe some people, but I don't think we're in a city where many people are like also worshiping Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad and things like that. But I think we are in a city where people are adding Jesus to their method of like self-improvement or business savviness or whatever. And there's you have to be really careful about how you nuance that out, because I want people to follow Jesus and be really good businessmen and women and lead their families and things like that. But that's why the language of our church is reorient your life. Do all those things with your orientation primarily around Jesus and not these other things.
Seek first the kingdom.
Exactly.
That's why
it's like we planned it that way.
So that was the last of our Seek First the Kingdom. We're done with that. And next week is the beginning of a new series. Still in Acts, but we have found kind of like thematically changing it up helps people stay tuned, and it kind of helps describe what's happening next. Because I do think there's a shift that happens between chapter 17 and chapter 18. We're about to see him embark on his third and final missionary journey.
Yeah. So, you're doing a better job tracking that stuff than I am, by the way.
Yeah, you're going to Genesis 1 always, and
No, I didn't go to Genesis this week.
You went to history.
I did go to history.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I go to the Bible, but no. But I will say something that Paul does that I think is great, and I think we use it as a template. Is he is an expert in their craft and their philosophy, and then tears it, dismantles it is your phrase. And I think we as Christians, not just pastors, but as Christians, I think we have a duty to never stop learning about the worldviews around us. And I know there's a fear that you can like fall into it. And then this is why Paul tells Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely. And this is why we adhere to the word of God as first and foremost and foundational. So if you're a brand new Christian, maybe just dive into Christianity for a while before doing this. But I think the job of a person who's preaching the gospel today is not just to say, oh, those terrible people over there, and to do like some crowd rally. It is like to say, hey, I get it. Here's where here's this worldview, and it's trying to answer this question, but what about this? And what about that? And slowly, and then show, but Christ is sufficient in all of these ways. So what is it? It's that surgically diagnosing our condition, our worldviews today, and then pointing to the sufficiency of Jesus is the job, which is a tough job.
Yeah, it's hard. That's what Paul does. I mean, he quotes their poets and...
Yeah, so he reads the source material.
Yeah.
And then tears it apart. Praise the Lord. I'm seeing a lot. I just finished Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of Jeremiah in Paul's life too. Because Jeremiah had to do that. And he was speaking against false teachers. And he had a message that wasn't liked. And he had to keep persevering. And I think it just seems, again, that Paul is really taking... Because they actually... Jeremiah is actually the largest book in the Bible. So I think Paul probably took a lot of encouragement from Jeremiah to keep, pressing forward. Because like you have that phrase, is that like chapter 22 or something in Jeremiah where he's like, I decided to stop talking, but then it was like fire in my bones, and I just had to keep proclaiming the gospel. That just so seems like Paul's life. Yeah,
that was another element of this that I didn't get to. I didn't have time for, but like the way of Jesus will conflict with the world, or like there's going to be resistance and people aren't going to always like the message. And so
even our own flesh as Christians.
Yeah. It starts with us, but then it works itself out. And so,
Wonderful. Well, you got anything else?
Nope.
That's the outro music. So what a great passage. What a great book. I'm actually kind of sad to be finishing Acts by the end of this year.
Yeah.
Lord willing.
No, we'll finish.
It's on the... When he says that every week, like, we have a schedule and we have followed the schedule.
I don't know. Anything could happen.
But to be fair, the last Sunday, it's going to be chapters 24 through 28.
4 chapters in one Sunday. So.
But it's one big narrative, so.
Yeah. Are you? I think you're teaching that one.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
That's how it always goes. I finish series. Well, no, you just did. But typically, I always finish them, and you always start them.
I don't know. That's never planned, but
Nope.
it always works out that way.
Usually when it's a brand new book, I'm like, you got it.
Yeah.
Because you'll do like the whole 30,000 feet and like how this relates to
Genesis.
Abraham. And, yeah.
I'm starting Advent too, the first week of Advent.
Yes, praise the Lord. I'm so excited for Advent. I
Yeah.
love Advent.
It's fun times.
Good times, good times.
Merry Christmas.
Put it on your calendars, guys. We have some fun stuff coming. Excited to serve our school on Saturday. Had a lot of good feedback after saying they're going to come and bring a power washer. I realized we can't bring 1,000 power washers because they only have so many hose units and spouts, whatever. But excited to clean up the campus. We also have Viking Feast coming up, and I need to show you. We're scheming. We're excited to kind of change the look this year and make it even better. So I feel like our solution, we can have Viking Feast rain or shine.
Yeah. You showed me a little bit.
Yeah.
So
We'll
let
have
them
cover.
let them wonder what that means.
Yeah. Again, people have asked why Viking Feast. People ask me at lunch.
Yeah.
So why Viking?
Yeah.
Did you even know the answer?
Yeah, because it was although it came from someone else, didn't it?
No. So my version of the story.
Your version.
You can check it.
Yeah, yeah.
My version of the story is that I was an RA. I gotta hurry because this song's about to end.
Yeah.
RA at CBU, we had to throw on events once a month. We had one big event per year though, and we decided to call it Viking Feast. It was right before Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving food, but no silverware. We'll have tiki torches everywhere and Viking music. So it's like everything has to have a theme. Everybody does Friendsgiving. So we're like, let's not do Friendsgiving. Let's do something that'll make people want to come. So we just said Viking Feast, and it was such a great turnout. I was like, if I ever plant a church one day, I want to do this again. And so then planted a church, and this will be our 8th annual Viking Feast.
Yeah.
And it's never super thematic. Like
there's fire and
we
music.
do what we can. So there's music and there's fire.
But
and
people
the food.
use silverware is what you're trying to say.
People use silverware and they come up with normal clothes. And I get that. It'd be weird if we all dressed up as Vikings. And we don't even know what that is. I wear my bear though every year.
Yeah.
That I killed in Arizona.
Yep.
And I drink from a horn. I don't even know Viking history. I'm just gonna be completely transparent. I just like the music, just like the the time of year vibe. But this is not about paganism or pantheism or anything like that.
Sure. I just preached on idolatry, so we'll see. We'll see what altars we have set up.